My indie game has a nice variety of enemies, but in general, they aren't very smart. They have good pathfinding, which I talked about in a video last year, but the way they attack has always been too basic. Just move towards the player and attack. My goal in this video is to make a new enemy AI system that's more dynamic with its movement and attack options. What makes this task more challenging is that I want everything to be as modular as possible. This means that any code that I write for one enemy should easily be applied to any other enemy. But I'm realizing that my last attempt at enemy AI wasn't as modular as it needs to be. The bosses are the best example of this. I gave each boss a variety of attacks, but these abilities were too complex for my modular setup, so in the end, there's a lot of custom code to get some of the attacks working, and it's all become a big mess. So again, I'm starting fresh, but I am keeping the pathfinding code. Just to recap, this works by having tile states that track line of sight with the player, and then the enemies use these tile points to navigate. Part of what makes the current enemies so boring is that they just float or walk in whatever direction they need to go. I think it'd be more interesting if they mix in other kinds of movement options like long jumps, teleporting, hopping, and dashing. This makes the chase a lot more fun, and then when the enemy is close enough, that's when the actual attack starts. I organized the code in a way where each attack has a map of intentions, which guide the enemy towards completing the attack in the best way. This enemy attacks by tackling the player, but before actually doing the tackle, the enemy needs to first approach the player, which is the first intention, followed by the actual attack or the tackle, which is the second intention. I use broad intentions here because I want this code to work for any given enemy. Since each enemy has its own set of movement options, these attack instructions are meant to be somewhat vague, but the enemy is smart enough to see this approach intention and look through its own movement options to decide on the best one to use. With all of this stuff together, the enemies already offer a decent level of challenge, but at the same time, they're still not intelligent. It's just mindlessly chasing me down and attacking really aggressively. Also, when there's multiple of the same enemy type, they have a tendency to sync up with each other, which looks a bit weird. There needs to be some kind of mix-up thrown in there to make things less predictable. That's why I added a random chance to retreat, which will cause the enemy to move away from the player. This is another kind of intention, just like approaching. When a retreat is triggered, the enemy is going to utilize the tile states, just like it does for regular pathfinding, but instead of moving towards the player using line of sight, it's going to widen the gap. You'll see the enemy sometimes turn and jump away from the player, and this mix-up makes the combat a lot more exciting. Now that there's a small amount of randomness added to the enemy logic, the behavior is much less likely to sync up with the other enemies of the same type. Fighting big groups like this is a lot of fun since there's plenty of movement all around the battlefield. It gets chaotic the more enemies you add, and thankfully I was very mindful of performance as I was reworking this enemy code. It takes a ton of enemies on screen before the game starts to slow down, so that should give me a lot of flexibility when it comes to designing specific fights and which enemies to include. There's no way I would ever come close to needing this many enemies, but the huge crowd reminds me of these scenes from Paper Mario, so maybe I could do something similar in my game. Thanks to keeping things modular, I'm able to use this exact same enemy code for boss fights. This new crocodile boss uses the same intention system, but what separates a boss like this from regular enemies is the amount of health, the total number of attacks, and other small tweaks that can make the fight harder, like interrupting enemy attacks. Regular enemies are meant to be weaker, so if you hit them while they're winding up for a tackle, you'll interrupt the attack completely. A big tough boss shouldn't be easily interrupted though, so I put in a poise flag that can be enabled for any given attack. Even small adjustments like this can make the combat a lot different. Since spamming your attack works on normal enemies, you'll instead need to be more strategic with the boss. From here, as I add more enemies to the game, I'll also be making new attacks for them to use. Each new attack will then be available for all the other enemies, so over time, I'm hoping to build up a big list of options. Maybe by the end, I can put everything together into one huge boss fight with a ton of variety. But that won't be for a while. I'm still hard at work on the upcoming Steam demo update. I wish I could get it out sooner, but there's so many aspects of the game that are still changing. If you want to play the game in its current state though, you can get the demo for free on Steam, and be sure to wishlist the game while you're there. And also, leaving a like on this video helps me out a ton. Thank you so much for the support, and thank you for watching.